Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Happy to have you here. This was the scene today outside Republican U.S. Senator John Cornyn's district office in Houston, Texas. What you can hear people saying there is, "Close the camps, close the camps." It was the same slogan at the federal building in Raleigh, North Carolina today. This was the scene in New York City today. Again, close the camps. Close the camps. These protests around the country today, these are not something that had a ton of lead time or a ton of national press attention. These were a fairly spontaneous thing. But there were close the camps protests that sprung up all over the country today, red states and blue states alike. On Friday last week, you might remember the head of the Homeland Security Department in the Trump administration told Congress that unfortunately his department, Homeland Security, was dealing with a new national sensation. That's the word he used, a sensation that had been unfairly created by what he called unsubstantiated allegations. Unsubstantiated allegations of terrible conditions and crowding at facilities locking up immigrants run by his department. He said the claims about those facilities and the conditions in which immigrants, including little kids, were being held, those were all unsubstantiated claims. There was no reason for the national uproar over this. There was no reason for this unfortunate sensation. All the supposed concern and criticism about those alleged conditions, they weren't based on reality, and they were just making things harder for his department. We heard something similar from an unnamed Customs and Border Patrol official who did a press call with reporters last week after a group of lawyers came out of Border Patrol facilities in Texas, describing what they said were the worst conditions they had ever seen in decades of monitoring conditions at facilities like that. After those lawyers came out of those facilities and started telling those stories, a Customs and Border Patrol official who would not give his or her name did a press call last week with reporters in which that official said, quote, "I personally don't believe these allegations." Well, today, the actual Department of Homeland Security released their own photographs and their own report, which they labeled a management alert, documenting exactly the same kinds of conditions in these facilities run by the Homeland Security Department that its own officials had been dismissing for the past week as unsubstantiated and sensational allegations. This report from Homeland Security, from the Inspector General, is about conditions in which both adults and kids are being held. The report is titled Management Alert. Homeland Security needs to address dangerous overcrowding and prolonged detention of children and adults in the Rio Grande Valley. This is the Inspector General from the Homeland Security Department reporting on what its personnel found when they made unannounced inspections at these facilities run by the Trump administration in South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley. And again, this comes right after the head of that agency and some senior official of Border Patrol went on the record with these public proclamations about these terribly unsubstantiated, hysterical allegations and how they don't really believe anything is wrong in these facilities. Well, here's their own department spelling it out, and remarkably, including pictures of what exactly they're describing. Start with just one of the 5 Border Patrol facilities they say they visited in South Texas. This is the Fort Brown Station, which is run by the Border Patrol in Brownsville, Texas. And this is not like in some border netherworld that isn't America, right? Some place that Americans never go to. This is not some off-planet facility separate and apart from American life where we could never have any idea this sort of thing was happening in our midst. I mean, the Fort Brown Border Patrol Station in Brownsville, look at it on the map. It's right next to a FedEx shipping center. There's a Subway sandwich shop right there on the corner. There's a little strip mall there called the Veterans Plaza. There's a bunch of churches nearby. It's basically right next to one of the campuses of the University of Texas. Their Rio Grande Valley campus is right there to the west of that facility, just a stone's throw from this Border Patrol facility that is run by the federal government of the United States with our taxpayer dollars. And according to the Homeland Security Department's Inspector General, And it is the Homeland Security Department that is running that facility. According to them, this is what's going on inside. Quote, senior managers at several facilities raised security concerns for their agents and the detainees. For example, one called the situation a ticking time bomb. We ended our visit at one border control facility early, this is the facility in Brownsville, because our presence was agitating an already difficult situation. Specifically, when detainees observed us, meaning detainees observed the inspectors, they banged on the cell windows, pressed notes to the window with their time in custody and gestured to their time, and gestured to things that indicated their time in custody, evidence of their time in custody, for example, beards. And then see figure 6. Here's figure 6. You see on the door, we've blown out that little upper right-hand corner there. It says capacity 41. That's the maximum capacity, the rated capacity by the fire marshal for the number of people who are ever supposed to be in that room. According to Homeland Security inspectors, at that moment, there were 88 men being held in that room with a maximum capacity of 41. Some of them, quote, signaling prolonged detention to Inspector General staff. That photo taken on June 12th, 2019. You see the sign there, help, 40 days. Quote, in these overcrowded conditions, Border Patrol was unable to meet its own standards. Although agency standards require Border Patrol to make a reasonable effort to provide a shower for adults after 72 hours, most single adults hadn't had a shower in Border Patrol custody, despite several being held as long as a month. At some facilities, Border Patrol was giving detainees wet wipes to maintain personal hygiene. Most adult detainees were wearing the clothes they arrived in days, weeks, and even up to a month prior. Further, although standards require agents to remain cognizant of detainees' religious and other dietary restrictions, many single adults had been receiving only bologna sandwiches. Some detainees on this diet were becoming constipated and required medical attention. At that same facility, at that Fort Brown station, again, right in the middle of that normal American neighborhood in Brownsville, Texas, the Inspector General also posted this photo of women. You see there on the left, and again there in a cell, you can see the capacity on the door. That's an overcapacity cell. You see the woman there at the front wearing an infection control mask, pressing her hands up against the glass, the women holding their hands up to try to communicate with, to try to plead to the inspectors. On the right, that's another cell, that one designed specifically for women, but it's holding adult men. That cell, again, capacity 41. The Inspector General says when they took that picture, there were 71 adult males in that room. You see one man there holding his hands up the glass as if he's praying. At that facility in Brownsville and at another one about an hour west in McAllen, Texas, the Homeland Security Department's Inspector General says single adults were held in standing room only conditions for a week. Some single adults held for more than a month in cells that were this crowded, literally not enough room to sit down, let alone lie down, standing room only. These are more images that the Inspector General included in its report today, specifically from the Border Patrol facility in McAllen, Texas. These are the conditions in which they're holding families. Again, these aren't people who've been convicted of any crime. They're being held by the federal government in conditions that the U.S. government didn't used to get itself into, at least for this duration, because they didn't have the same kind of policies about holding on to people indefinitely. I mean, you can see these aren't facilities that are designed to hold people for any length of time at all. This is a pen, basically, a concrete floor. And they're holding people in conditions just like this for weeks and months at a time. The Inspector General's office has blurred out a lot of the faces in these pictures, but as you can see, this includes little kids being held in these conditions, including in one of those photos where they've got the Mylar blankets that kind of look like aluminum foil, and possibly one and maybe both of those images. It's a little hard to tell. We tried to get higher resolution photos from the Department of Homeland Security. They wouldn't give us anything at a higher resolution. But in those photos, as you can see, it looks like those kids may be being held on their own, away from adults, away from their families. But again, at this resolution, it is hard to see. There's another facility where the inspectors dropped in unannounced. This is Weslaco, Texas, which I think is the way you say it, Weslaco. It's in between McAllen and Brownsville. And again, this is in the middle of a normal American neighborhood. This facility is right next door to an Olive Garden and a Longhorn Steakhouse. And there's a Lowe's Home Improvement right there on the same side of the street. It's next to the local police station. It's across the street from a Super 8 motel. And these are the conditions inside that facility in America. And this is not like a waiting room, an overcrowded waiting room where people are parked for an hour or two before they are processed and moved on. This isn't a waiting area. This is housing. This is the living conditions as provided by the U.S. government, as provided on an indefinite basis for days, for weeks, for more than a month, even for these little kids. It's not like this is a room where they hang out and then they go to the room where they sleep. This is it. Legally, the U.S. government cannot detain kids specifically longer than 72 hours before it needs to move them out somewhere else. But in this case, it's just holding on to them. The Inspector General says even in these 5 facilities, they found hundreds of kids being held beyond that legal limit. According to the Inspector General, quote, children at 3 of the 5 Border Patrol facilities we visited had no access to showers. At the facilities, children had limited access to a change of clothes. Border Patrol had few spare clothes and no laundry facilities. 2 facilities had not provided children access to hot meals until the week we arrived. And again, this is the agency's own report on its own behavior, right? This is the Inspector General from the Homeland Security Department. And for the second time in a month, they have put out a report like this. This is a management alert, second one in a month, specifically about dangerous overcrowding and prolonged and inappropriate detention facilities, detention conditions. Those conditions identified in May and now identified again as a serious issue that requires immediate attention. Quote, while our prior management alert identified similar issues with respect to single adults, this alert highlights additional concerns with respect to unaccompanied children and families being detained in the facilities we visited. Quote, we remain concerned that Homeland Security is not taking sufficient measures to address prolonged detention in Border Patrol custody. Now, when it comes to this new report, with these photos from these facilities in Brownsville and McAllen and the towns in between, we know that the Homeland Security Department and the Trump administration got advance notice that this blistering report was coming out. And we know that 2 ways. First of all, we know it because BuzzFeed News had a report a few days ago that this was coming, and that this report was going to portray conditions that were dire and shocking. BuzzFeed reported that it was already circulating inside the Homeland Security Department, but had not yet been publicly released. Well, we also know, however, that the Homeland Security Department got advance notice that this report was coming out, because when they did finally publicly release it today, at the introduction to the report today, the Inspector General says overtly that the department was provided a draft of this report. They were allowed to provide comments on a draft of this report before this final version of it was published so we could all see it today. So they knew this was coming. They've known this was coming for more than days, maybe as much as a week or 2. Pictures that they included in the report, they say were taken around July 11th, July 12th. How soon after that they knew this report was coming, we don't know, but they've had advance notice. We know they knew the whole country was about to see all of these pictures of these families and these little kids and these men and the standing room only cells with people pleading for help and banging on the glass and saying they've been held in conditions like this for 40 days, please help. They knew this was coming. They likely knew this was coming today. Well, what's the consequence of that? Tonight, NBC News is reporting that somehow Customs and Border Patrol urgently figured out a way to move out most of the kids they admit were in their custody. As of a month ago, Border Patrol said they had 2,350 kids under their control. As of today, the day this report comes out, miraculously, they say it's down below 300. Now, we don't know what it was that lit a fire under Border Patrol to finally start moving kids out of these conditions in such significant numbers. But between, close the camps becoming a rallying cry across the country, and these photos being released, and this Inspector General report being released, documenting this stuff and letting the department know, hey, in a few days, we're going public with this and everybody's going to see these images. And with van loads of Democratic members of Congress turning up at these facilities now and describing what they saw. And at least in some cases, refusing to hand over their phones so they could, despite the insistence from the agency, actually videotape what was going on inside these places and take pictures. I mean, somewhere in there, choose your own adventure here, but one of those things might have become, at last, an effective pressure point on the Border Patrol to move hundreds, maybe as many as 2,000 kids out of their custody in short order. Today, there was another one of those congressional delegations that went into the facility holding immigrants in Homestead, Florida. Yesterday, it was members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus who showed up at some of these facilities in Texas. When I mentioned that, at least in a few instances, we had members of Congress who were able to take pictures or video inside these facilities, despite the agency telling them not to. One of the videos that I'm describing there was shot by a member of Congress named Joaquin Castro from Texas. He's the brother of presidential candidate Julian Castro, who incidentally is going to be here live on set with us in just a moment. And I know we featured this video from Congressman Castro last night on the show, and you may have seen it, but just watch toward the end here when you can hear the discussion in the room. And when it becomes clear that one of the things these members of Congress are doing in the room is pressing the staff at this facility in El Paso, advocating for these women who they've been interviewing, who they've been meeting with, and who need some very specific medical care that they haven't been able to get. There, for example, is a discussion about a woman who's had her medication taken away from her. Some of the members of Congress on this delegation said that they spoke with a woman who had epilepsy, who had not been given access to her anti-epileptic medication. But there's also this discussion in this room on this video with another woman who has been told that she needs to get a biopsy.
There's a woman here who the doctor told her she needs a biopsy for the lump on her back. And there's no plan to do anything.
So that we don't have a next stop. We obviously don't have the facilities to do a surgical biopsy, but we'll make sure that we're continuing her care. It's on her record. And when she gets to her next stop, wherever that is, whether it's in our custody or out, those records go with her.
Is the nurse like on the tour we're getting today?
You hear the person representing the facility there saying, oh, we obviously don't have the ability to do anything like that here. I mean, clearly, these women are now being housed in a room with no furniture, just with blankets, right? So, no, we don't have the facility to get you your biopsy, but we'll make sure you get access to that when you go to your next stop. We'll make sure that's noted in your... Well, will you? Really? I mean, that's individual members of Congress in the room pressing on issues like that, saying, is this woman going to get her biopsy? She's been told by the doctor that she needs to have this biopsy. What's going on with that? We'll make sure that gets handled. Having a member of Congress there, or 10, pressing on an issue like that tends to make a pressure point out of circumstances like that. And indeed, after that video was shot just yesterday at that border facility in El Paso by Congressman Castro, today in El Paso, these community doctors who've been involved in treating immigrants at various community-based organizations that see immigrants and refugees, they came forward to say, no, they are not getting adequate access to these immigrants, to the kids, to the mothers, to the fathers, to the families, to the individual adults traveling through here. They say, contrary to the way it has been in the past, by the time they're being allowed to see anyone who has been in federal custody, they are finding that the people who they're finally getting access to are dehydrated, they've got untreated infectious diseases, they've been denied medication for chronic conditions even if they had it with them when they came in. They are now getting people from the U.S. federal government in such bad shape, they are finding it to be dangerous in unprecedented ways. And so these local community doctors from these neighborhoods in America nearby these facilities where these folks are being held, they're demanding more access.
There's no one better than us to take care of these men, women, and children. We have the contacts of other specialists if we need those specialists. They don't. And to this day, we are not allowed any contact with whoever's providing the medical care over there. And that's just not... It's very upsetting, and I hope to God that this changes quickly. So no contact is allowed between whoever's providing medical care in the centers and us on the outside. That is piss poor medical care. That is not medical care. That's malpractice. And we ask over and over and over again. I've been interviewed by multiple news agencies, and that is my biggest beef. Let us in there. We have the doctors that are willing to go in there.
The pressure on this is only going to increase both locally in the neighborhoods and communities where these facilities exist, but also around the country. It's only going to increase in coming days. I mean, part of the reason we know that is because Congressman Elijah Cummings on the Oversight Committee in Congress has announced that next week, Friday, July 12th, there's going to be an oversight hearing in Congress on the conditions in these facilities and the border and the behavior of the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Patrol in particular. Congressman Cummings had previously asked the Secretary of Homeland Security and the head of Customs and Border Patrol to come testify. He says that he had no confirmation whether or not they would appear. Now he is restating that demand. And I think it'll be hard for those officials to stay away. I mean, the Homeland Security Secretary has been proven wrong now by his own agency. Right? He went to Congress and said these allegations about bad conditions in his facilities, these were just unsubstantiated allegations that were creating a sensation. That was a handful of days ago. Now his own agency has published these photos and this urgent management alert calling exactly the same alarm, right? Saying exactly the same thing, which he was dismissing as unsubstantiated just days ago. Customs and Border Patrol has had to announce that there are now 2 separate inquiries into a Facebook group that was exposed by ProPublica, which includes thousands of posts from what appear to be current and former Border Patrol agents, including overt threats to specific members of Congress and mocking the deaths of immigrants in federal custody. And so the pressure is only increasing on the Trump administration and by the individual officials responsible within the Trump administration as more is known and as more alarms are sounded about what they've been trying to do to these human beings that have come into their clutches on the border. But we are in what I think of as a position of sort of political and moral tension right now, where the exposure of what they've been doing and the pressure it is engendering, that pressure is having an effect. But it's not like they've been doing any of this stuff by accident, right? And it's not like they're terribly ashamed of what they've been doing. The Trump White House is not exactly losing sleep over any perception that under President Trump, the U.S. government might be particularly abusive toward immigrants. I mean, the White House, for example, has just announced that the president still wants to launch a nationwide roundup of immigrant families specifically. They make sure they get that into every discussion. This proposed roundup from the president, he initially promised it would be millions of people rounded up. It has been delayed several times in the past couple of weeks. He's been firing his way through federal agency heads, trying to get somebody who's going to agree to do it and do it the way he wants it. But he's now announcing, the White House is now saying that President Trump wants those roundups of immigrant families around the country to start right after the 4th of July. Kind of the finale for the fireworks, right? On the second night of the Democratic debate last week, on Thursday, the Trump administration also floated a new idea on immigration, which is the sort of thing you might like cook up in a lab if you were trying to design the most gut-wrenching, merciless, designed to be offensive policy, right, that you could possibly imagine. Something that was designed to stoke outrage and show off, cruelty and intentional infliction of pain for people who least deserve it. Like it was a contest for that. This is what you'd submit to try to win. This was the headline at NPR on Thursday. Quote, Trump wants to withdraw deportation protections for families of active troops. They think that there hasn't been enough outrage. They're not getting enough supposedly negative attention for the way they treat immigrants. And so the next anti-immigrant thing they're floating, and they floated it right as the Democratic presidential candidates were getting to the debate stage. I'm sure they were hoping this would be a topic of discussion. Literally what they're floating now is deporting U.S. military families, deporting the family members of active duty serving U.S. troops. How do you like that? Does that get you mad? I mean, the pressure against these agencies does have an effect on what these agencies do. The courts do have an effect on what they can get away with. Just today, an ACLU lawsuit was successful in blocking the Trump administration from keeping people locked up wholesale for the crime of requesting asylum in this country, which is not a crime. The Trump administration changed U.S. policy after decades so that now the response of the U.S. government to somebody asking for asylum is that that person gets locked up with no hearing. According to a federal judge today, you cannot do that under the law and the Constitution. That federal judge today blocked what the Trump administration has been trying to do, essentially reinstating the previous process that the U.S. government used for the last half a century to deal with asylum claims. The Trump administration today also gave up on its effort to basically try to hotwire the U.S. Census in a way that appeared to be deliberately designed to undercount Latinos and thereby undercut Latino voting power and skew congressional districts toward Republicans and toward white people in particular, at least for a decade and maybe even longer. A Supreme Court ruling striking down the Trump administration's effort to rejigger the census last week was written in such a way that the Trump administration could maybe have tried to come back at it and convince the court to let them do it in time for the 2020 census. But today, the Trump administration gave up. They decided they couldn't do it. And at least for the 2020 census, they will not try to get away with that this time. And so in this environment, in this position of political and moral tension, what do you do if you're, say, a Democratic presidential candidate who's trying to earn the right to represent the Democratic Party in the general election to defeat Donald Trump? You're a candidate who cares deeply about an issue like this, as polls show most Democratic voters do. I mean, it turns out that outrage does have an effect. Exposure does have an effect. Pressure does work. The courts do provide some refuge. And also, at the same time, this is the turf on which Donald Trump wants to contest the next election. He is running on purpose on a position of maximum cruelty toward immigrants of every station. Kids, families, literally the family members of serving active duty U.S. troops. Who else you got? I mean, he's running on a kick puppies platform, right? And so the Democratic Party is coming in deeply opposed to what he's doing and trying to say, you know, this ground on which you are changing American values and American policy and treating people in this way, we want to contest you on this ground. And the more they do, the more the Trump administration wants it and the more they keep upping the ante in terms of their performative cruelty on this issue. And these are real people's lives. And if this is one of the issues you care most about, how do you beat the Trump administration? How do you beat President Trump on this issue in the election while being cognizant of the fact that this is exactly the fight he wants to have? And anything you throw at him on this, he thinks makes him stronger. I know just the guy to ask. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.